I appreciate the invitation. My colleague, Holly Lisenby, couldn't be here, as Hamad just said. So I'm going to try to cover a few things. I don't have slides, so I'm just going to do this off the cuff. I really appreciate hearing the different perspectives from the journals and from scientists in general. I'm going to start broad. First, I'll tell you a little bit more about my position because I think it's relevant, and then start a little bit broader and then maybe narrow down to something that might be actually helpful, which we always try to be. So the Brain Initiative, many of you may know, many of you may not, is I'm actually at the National Institute of Mental Health at NIH, but I'm the deputy director of Brain. And Brain actually is a combination of 10 different institutes at NIH, all of the brain neuroscience institutes, any of the 10 institutes that have some part of their budget going into neuroscience are part of the Brain Initiative. So most of it, many of our staff are at NINDS, the the Neurological Disorders and Stroke Institute. I purposely came from NIMH because it just shows how collaborative we're trying to be across the institutes as we're tackling some pretty significant problems. We are focused mainly on technology development and new approaches to understanding how the brain works, and that covers a very broad area of science from cell biology to circuit biology to whole brain imaging to stimulation, modulation, et cetera. And one of the things that as a funding agency, we try not to do at NIH, again, I'm not going to speak for all of NIH, but we try not to be top down in many of the things that we do. We obviously represent the interests of large communities of researchers, and we like these sorts of standards that what we're talking about today to bubble up from the community. It would be very unusual for NIH to impose standards on researchers or on the research community in way, shape, or form. That said, we recognize the importance of the transparency, the rigor, all of the things that we've talked about. I won't reiterate. And I'm just going to take it up a level to think the other thing that we worry a lot about is public trust in the research. And I think that could be part of the narrative here. I think the public trust in research took a hit over COVID for many reasons we don't have to discuss. But I think the more that we do in this area, the more we build public trust, and the public will support the efforts of scientists in general. So as many of you know who've applied for NIH funding, there are several items that you may have come across in grant applications, all kinds of checklists, right? We're bureaucrats, that's what we do. We have the several years ago, we brought the rigor and reproducibility sets of standards online, where investigators applying for NIH grants have to put in their grant application how they are addressing rigor in various ways, and that's different for every scientific project. We also have things like the common data elements. Many of you may be familiar. If you Google NIH and CDE's common data elements, you'll see that there are validated checklists validated by the community across a number of measures and a number of approaches. One of the things I just said is that NIH doesn't impose standards, but there are a number of funding opportunities that specify CDEs must be used in the grants that are submitted in those funding announcements. So we utilize them in specific ways. And for some types of measures, for some types of science, there are existing validated measures that the NIH would adhere to, or at least encourage the use of in grant applications and in the science in general. So as part of the Brain Initiative, I'll come down a level now. We basically are the size of an NIH institute in terms of budget and number of people working on this. So because of that, we're able to arrange our science in ways that may be a little bit unusual. We don't have lots of R01s, for example. We have lots of team science, lots of consortia that are working on a hard problem together. Because we're on the cutting edge, we hope, of innovation, many of those groups actually work among themselves to develop standards, whether it's methodological standards, data standards in general, data collection standards. And one of the things that has been really important is understanding the metadata of each of the approaches that are used. That's been really key and not as easy as you might think, having been on in a number of these discussions. But those are all publishable. Obviously, they are all important parts of the team science approaches that are used in the Brain Initiative. We have some of our large consortia already putting their protocols on things like Protocol ZIO, which I don't know much about it, but I just saw a presentation about it. And I think those are areas that NIH encourages, the broader publication of data and methods more broadly. We support data archives. So that this is all of you, I'm sure, know the new data standards, or not data standards, the need for sharing data and being transparent about data. And so NIH did bring on this data sharing policy, which everybody has to adhere to. The Brain Initiative already had a fairly assertive data sharing policy anyway for our grant. So one of the things we did was fund these data archives, where anyone who is supported by the Brain Initiative has to deposit their data in these archives. And the archives are investigators from around the globe that help to intake the data. There are QC pipelines, et cetera, and then accessibility and availability of the data is the key endpoint that we're all interested in. So we have funding opportunities to support all of that. One of the key things, coming down even more to a point that I think is going to be interesting for this group, I'm going to put this in the chat. We have a funding announcement through the Brain Initiative on, where's my keyboard is already buried, to develop and define data standards for science that is specific to the Brain Initiative. And the things we're talking about, any sort of neuroimaging, recording, modulation, stimulation, all of those things would be a relevant topic for developing and defining standards that can be used in experiments. This is early on in the process before journals can impose expectations of authors, for example. But we think this is an important part of the process, because this is not something that would be typical that you could get NIH funding for. But what's encouraged in this announcement is the community input, the broader input to developing these types of standards. These are 3-year awards. We have one final receipt date on this iteration in June. So, put your grant writing hats on. But again, I think having the community-based approach, not just the scientific community, but having journals involved too, I think is really interesting. Journals and NIH have similar incentives, or they're not identical, but NIH can say, we want this, this, and this, and folks won't get the money. They won't get the funding to do their experiments unless they adhere in compliance with those expectations. And then journals have the power of being able to say yes or no to authors and publishing. So there's a really important set of a teamwork here that I think we can leverage. So I'd say take a close look at this, and maybe this will be something that would satisfy part of what we're talking about, at least on this call. I'm not sure I have much to add, but I'm happy to answer additional questions and certainly be part of this discussion going forward. Thanks, Hamed, for the invitation.